Good morning. As Chris mentioned, I'm the Chair of Pediatrics and Physician-in-Chief here. I also have the pleasure of being the Director of the Child Health Research Institute here at Stanford. In short, this institute, its mission and vision is to launch healthy lives. It's my honor to introduce our first keynote speaker today, Dr. Ellen Guttmacher. Dr. Guttmacher is the Director of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. It's the NIH's focal point for research into children's health, but it also investigates maternal health, reproductive health, intellectual development and disabilities, and also rehabilitation medicine. Prior to assuming his position as director of the NICHD, Alan was at the National Human Genome Research Institute. Most of you are aware that this institute is charged to take genetic research forward and investigate its implications for human health and disease. It also investigates the social, legal, and ethical aspects of this genetic research. Dr. Guttmacher is both a pediatrician and a medical geneticist. He went to Harvard Medical School, where he then followed this up by a residency in pediatrics and also a fellowship in medical genetics. His lifetime achievements have been recognized by his election to the Institute of Medicine. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our introductory keynote, Dr. Guttmacher.
Thanks very much, Hugh. And it's a real pleasure to be here, both to really, I think, commend Stanford. What you heard from Dean Miner before, I think, is an accurate depiction of the leading role that many folks in this room, in fact, are taking in terms of the issues that I'm certainly going to be talking about today. I have to confess I'm only going to be able to do it at the greatest level, perhaps 30,000 foot level. Most of it's going to be higher elevation than that, but having seen something about the rest of the agenda, I think you'll be getting a much more erudite discussion in some detail about a number of the themes I'm going to bring up. It's also a pleasure to be here because of the fact that I can actually honestly say I have no conflicts of interest, and I would be in Leavenworth as a federal bureaucrat instead of here if I were. I'd never noticed before that there is actually some similarity in the architecture. I always thought of Stanford as having this lovely, completely of its own sort of campus, but clearly some of the architectural thought, I think, is similar. Your lawns are much nicer than Leavenworth, though. So in this 60,000 foot tour, whatever it's going to be, I'm really going to try to skate across four major points, all of which I think underscore the fact that as we think about the future of maternal and child health research, it's very different from simply recapitulating or even embroidering upon the past. I would argue we are at an inflection point in terms of this kind of research, and that it's the kind of thinking that goes on in this room and around this meeting that will help us really underscore that it is an inflection point and not simply a little bit more of what we've done before. And that's partly because we know more than we used to, and because of that, I really believe that the fundamental questions we ask are different and need to be different. Also, we need to remark upon the fact that children's health and lives have changed, partly because of the work of folks in this area over the last few decades, but for other reasons as well. And because their health and their lives have changed, so therefore must the questions we ask. We also need to employ new kinds of methods, and a lot of this conference really is about that. The new kinds of methods that we've recently developed that we are now developing to be able to ask the complex questions that we need to really challenge ourselves with. But at the end, I also want to make clear, and I know this is a theme that runs through a lot of the work here at Stanford, that this isn't about health in a narrowly defined way. That what we're really about is changing the arc of children's lives. And that is more than simply the medical context. The medical model is useful, but it's not sufficient, I think, for the kinds of research and the kinds of applications of research that we should all be involved in. So first of all, as our knowledge changes, so must our questions. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, very well established, again, research, some of which has been done here, the fact that antenatal corticosteroids are a real aid in terms of reducing morbidity and mortality in the newborn. Well demonstrated in the US and other similarly resourced countries. So there was an assumption by many, well, that's great. Why don't we take this to resource poorer countries? We know that it works here. Let's use that in other settings. And there's a real push by some folks to say, let's just do that. But I think because we had this knowledge, we then had to ask the next question, well, will it actually work in those contexts? And many of you will have read this publication earlier this year in The Lancet, which demonstrates, at least in this rather large trial, not only does it not work, it increases morbidity and mortality. Now that we know that, that raises other questions. Obviously, why? Is it just this trial? Is it the fact that folks were so focused on the antenatal corticosteroids that they stopped doing something else that they'd been doing instead that was a benefit to the newborn? Why is that? Is it because of the lack of the same kind of newborn ICUs and other things that we have in these regions? Those are the kinds of questions we now have to ask. The whole nature versus nurture issue, of course, by now we've learned it's neither, it's clearly both. So now the questions we need to be asking, and we're beginning to ask, is, well, that's great. How do nature and nurture, how do the environment broadly describe, and our biological makeups, our genetics amongst other things, how do they combine to create health, to lead to disease, and very much how do we begin to use that knowledge as we get it to really have an impact on kids' lives? Of course, that brings us to the whole area of epigenetics, already mentioned by Dean Miner, appropriately, I think. And this is clearly one of the reasons why I think we're at an inflection point, that we are beginning to develop the tools where we really can go beyond association to causation, that we can go beyond saying, if this happens, you are at a greater risk for that, to try to really figure out what are the pathways, what are the mechanisms, be they biological pathways, environmental pathways, or a combination of the two, that lead from point A to point B. Because if we want to change the course of kids' lives and not get them to point B, then we need to understand the map, how they're getting from one to another, not just the fact that there is this association. And that's where I think the real, again, potentials for us go. That leaves to the whole area of developmental origins of health and disease. Child is father of the man, that very importantly is mother of the woman as well. I know that Matt Gilman and others will be speaking to you right after me about this in much more detail. Again, this is a question about getting beyond associations. We've established that now. We have that knowledge. So now the questions we need to ask are not so much what are the associations, but why are the associations? What are the factors that lead from one point to another so that we can really, therefore, use those as opportunities to intervene in childhood about lifelong health? I would hope that the pediatric practice of the future in terms of anticipatory guidance won't just be about the next 6 weeks, the next 6 months, or even the next 6 years of life. It'll be about the next 6 decades. How do we, as pediatricians, begin to really have lifelong imprint upon the health of the kids that we see? Those are the kinds of questions we should be asking. So what about this idea that children's health and lives change, so that should change the research we're doing? Well, clearly, for instance, we've made some real progress. I mean, if you look at this chart for US infant mortality, clearly if you look in a global sense, we haven't done as well, though we've done pretty well. But it's remarkable to the degree that we've made a number of improvements. This is pediatric deaths from ALL, done decade by decade, and you can see each decade vast improvements over prior decades. A disease that used to be 80% lethal is now less than 20% lethal. We've flipped that. H-flu disease, if you just look at basically the red line there, it's, how often do you see this? When I was a resident, I saw so many cases of H-flu disease, I literally could not tell you how many I saw. When I ask medical students or residents today, how many cases of H-flu have you seen? Usually one hand goes up. And I assume that's somebody they're afraid that everybody else has seen one, so they better raise their hands. But in fact, it's just sort of it's like polio was for me as a resident. I got to see an iron lung, but I never saw a patient who was actively engaged with having polio. It's the same kind of thing, huge inroads in terms of infectious disease particularly. But again, as children's health and lives changes so much our research questions, things just from the past month. I don't have to tell folks out in California that there are some issues about childhood immunizations. So now our work is not simply to develop new and more effective vaccines, it's to figure out how do we best get those vaccines into kids. And I think this is clearly a research question, a set of research questions. It also, I think, raises, as I'll get back to towards the end of my talk, some societal questions. The idea of to whom do children, quote unquote, belong? How far do parents' rights extend in terms of making decisions about their children? I think this is something clearly has evolved with time, our view of that. That's not a medical question, it's a societal question, but it's a darn important societal question. SIDS deaths. Again, if you just follow the colored line, you can see how SIDS deaths have gone down. The rate of SIDS deaths today in the US is well less than half of what it was before the back to sleep campaigns and those kinds of interventions started. Remarkable, again, decrement in that. I was reminded of that. I had an email with my wife a little bit earlier today. Happens to be the anniversary of the death in 1960 of her younger brother from SIDS. We don't worry about that so much for our grandchildren. Even though it happened in her family, it happened to her brother, she remembers it's something that marked her and her family for the rest of their lives. That's a rarer event than it used to be. Incredible progress, really important, based upon observation that then was, by research, shown to really make a difference, and we're continuing to make inroads there. But even there, despite this wonderful job in reducing SIDS deaths to a remarkable degree, we still need to have research. This is an association. We know several factors that play a role, but we still don't really understand the underlying mechanism, and it's going to be hard to get that rate much farther down until we do that. As well, even today, there are large disparities that remain in terms of SIDS rates among various population groups. We understand some of the factors responsible for those disparities, but we certainly don't understand all of them. And we need better research both to understand the etiology of the disparities, but also particularly implementation research to have better tools to be able to make a difference in kids' lives. It shouldn't matter the socioeconomic status, it shouldn't matter the circumstances in which a kid is born into in terms of health outcomes, but it certainly still does, and that's something else that I think you're going to be hearing more about at this meeting. Even some places where we have good news sometimes brings bad news in its wake. Certain conditions get rarer, but others become more common. Interesting graph or set of graphs in the New England Journal of Medicine over a decade ago showing that as infectious disease is getting rarer, immune disorders are getting more common. Now, what the relationship is between those two graphs is a long and interesting discussion, but the fact is that some things are getting more common even though we're doing a better job with others. And even for some conditions for which the incidence or prevalence may not be changing, as we reduce the burden of other diseases, that makes them relatively more important. I think arguably you could say, and there's certainly a lot of work about this here, that preterm birth, if you could obliterate one condition and make a difference in children's lives, both in the US and globally, this might well be the one you would choose. Huge issue around the world, and it's one where the US, of course, does not look so great, both in terms of absolute number, which is partly because of our size. We're the 6th largest contributor to preterm birth in the world in terms of just incidence kind of thing. But that's not just because of size, it's because we do such a lousier job than many other developed countries in terms of prevention of preterm birth. We clearly still do not know all of prematurity's causes. Some people would suggest we don't even know most of them. Again, we know a bunch of associations, but we don't know the pathways. We need to figure out those pathways. We need to figure out what are the true causes, biological, environmental, social, cultural, etc., that add to preterm birth. Because to really do a good job in prevention, and I would argue we have not spent enough energy and resources thinking about prevention. We've gotten way better at treating preterm birth. Our job, with my apologies to everyone here whose salary depends upon, our job should be to put neonatologists out of business, or at least change their business model. we shouldn't be having the amount of preterm birth we do in the US. Yes, we need to keep doing a better job of taking care, because there will always be some kids born preterm, but we should be making them much rarer. And of course, there are other conditions become of greater relative importance. Autism. So this is, there have been a couple studies since then. There are great discussions about what the true incidence of autism. This was, I think in some ways, though it has some flaws, perhaps methodologically the best study done yet in South Korea, which would argue that 1 in 38 children is born with autism. Now, maybe the rate is higher in South Korea than it is in other places, so I don't know why in the world that would be. It's a huge issue. Now, of course, a real issue for us is the true incidence increasing, or is it simply that we're much better at recognizing it than we used to be? We know we are better at recognizing it, but at least there's certainly at least a suggestion, and some would say clear evidence, that the true incidence is increasing. Whether it's increasing or not, it's a common problem, much more common than we used to recognize, and we need to do a much better job of understanding, again, what are the pathways that lead to autism so we can truly think about preventing it. And we also have to do a much better job of dealing with it when it does occur. That is education, medical interventions, other kinds of things for the lives of those on the spectrum. And we also, and I'll come back to this, as a society, we need to continue to change so those who are on the spectrum can have fuller lives and participate more fully in society. Obesity, clearly, for those of us in pediatrics, a huge problem. It does look as though the incredible increase in obesity in our society has leveled off, but it's leveled off at what anyone would say is an unacceptably high level, so we have much work to be done there, clearly. Traumatic brain injury. Now, this is an interesting, if you look at graphs of hospitalizations for traumatic brain injury, in fact, in the younger age groups, they're going down slightly in the last few years, but this is for ED visits. So visits to the emergency department, and you can see how they've skyrocketed for younger kids. Now, how much is this simply better recognition? Even some would say over-recognition. Well, the fact is we don't understand concussion, so we can't tell you whether it's over-recognition. We don't know what the true definitions are. We don't know what the true biomarkers are. We don't know what the real evidence, we don't have evidence-based return to play, return to school, or anything else. We do our best, but we need to have much better research to truly understand what is a pretty common problem, certainly in the US, but lots of other places as well. Children's lives have also changed. Frequent exposure to electronic technology, the question about, does this really change the developing brain in any way? Certainly changes kids' lives. Cyberbullying. When I was a resident, I didn't worry much about cyberbullying because cyber hadn't been invented yet. For today's pediatricians, if you're really interested in prevention and having kids having full lives, etc., you need to be thinking about this. Helicopter parenting. I don't think we had the term when I was a resident. We had helicopters, we had parenting, but we hadn't mixed the two before. How does that change kids' lives? There's a wonderful anecdote, and it makes for great op-ed articles that are really fascinating, but what do we really know about this? The availability of e-cigarettes. Since e hadn't been invented again when I was a resident, there weren't any e-cigarettes. How does it? Patterns of other substance abuse, youth and abuse, has clearly changed or continuing to change. We need to be aware of that and react to those. Shifting dynamics of family formation, of poverty, of other social influences on kids' lives that change the health milieu and certainly change the well-being of children. And you can go on and on, you can make slides and slides of this, but I think, again, our research questions have to mirror children's lives. So we need to employ new research approaches, resources, and tools. What might that mean? Well, we clearly have lots of new tools, luckily, that we can be using, and we already have begun to use, some of them developed around here. As you heard before, I'm guilty of being a medical geneticist and having been at the National Human Genome Research Institute before I came to NICHD. But in defense, it is the second best institute at NIH, the NHGRI, so it wasn't a bad place to grow up. But just to talk about genomics a little bit, this is a graph from an article in Science in 2002, which shows how many disorders do we know genes that played a role in? Now, the good news is in the pink, because you can see you get to use the scale over on the left, that's 1,700 human Mendelian traits, basically single gene disorders, things like cystic fibrosis, neurofibromatosis, Marfan syndrome, et cetera, for which we knew the gene involved. That seems pretty great until you realize there's 6,000 or 7,000 such conditions. So we had, we'd more than scratched the surface. We didn't know much. But the really depressing is when you look in the blue, because you have to use the scale on the right-hand side. And particularly when you look at the blue down at the bottom, because the blue that's a little higher up is all complex traits. It doesn't have human associated with it. So that includes rats, mice, primates, et cetera. But when you get to human primates, you're down only 8 disorders for which we clearly knew, common disorders, not single gene disorders, for which we knew things like diabetes, schizophrenia, things that are common, for which we actually knew genes involved in 2002. Well, something happened. Several things happened. One of them is this. I can tell you, in the genomic sphere for years, people patted themselves in the back, trying to be Silicon Valley-esque, saying we were following Moore's law, that every 24 months, the cost of doing genome sequencing was going down by 50%, et cetera. It was great. Well, it turns out the genomics community was under-patting itself, because in fact it was doing better than Moore's law, and you can see that with so-called next-gen sequencing, et cetera, it started doing way better, because this is a logarithmic graph. The Human Genome Project, when it ended in 2003, had cost about $2.7 billion to sequence that first genome, and it took about 13 years. Today, it's something that could be done easily in a couple of days, and it costs as an order of magnitude $1,000 to $5,000, depending upon the quality you want. Nothing, even your IRA hasn't fallen that quickly in terms of value in that period. It's a remarkable technological kind of change. And what that meant is it enabled the kind of research that now, if you redid that graph, we'd be way up, we'd be in the hundreds of disorders for which we actually know one or more genes involved. Microbiomics, the idea of understanding the microbiome, so incredibly important. Again, a lot of it, very important. David Relman and others at Stanford played a leading role in this. The idea that, most of this may be discomforting for you this early in the morning, but most of the DNA that you have on you at the moment is not yours. Most of the DNA you have on you by an order of magnitude or more actually belongs to those microbes that you have with you. Now, before you run out and try to get rid of them, realize that many of them are essential to maintaining health. On the other hand, some of them are essential for causing disease. We haven't really figured out that dance yet, but we now have the tools to begin to do that, and clearly, in some scenarios, have figured that out. Hugely important. A decade ago, we knew nothing about it. Newborn screening, something clearly has been a cornerstone of pediatrics for over 50 years, arguably one of the greatest public health advances in pediatrics. It's going to change dramatically in a few years, because in a few years it will be possible at a reasonable cost, a couple $100, I would argue, maybe less, to completely sequence the genome of a newborn. That's a wonderful technical achievement. We've got to figure out. Here's some research questions for you. The technical aspects of this, you don't want a whole lot of false positives. The medical aspects of this, how do we as pediatricians use this information? The societal issues, how do we as parents, grandparents, et cetera, use it? How do we as individuals use this information? Things that we better figure out in the next few years, because it's going to be available. So here's another interesting application of genomics, so-called chemical genomics, using genomics and other high-throughput strategies to look for new drug targets. Now, maybe we don't really have to. So this is your only multiple choice question of my talk anyway, which is, you have about 20,000 genes that make us human. It's interesting, when I was a professor not that long ago, I said with some confidence to the medical students I was lecturing that it was 100,000 genes. But luckily, I assume they've all forgotten that I said that. It turns out there are only about 20,000. So now that we know that, for how many of them and their products, the proteins they make, do you think we have at least one drug targeting that gene and its products? And by drug, I mean a prescription drug, an over-the-counter drug, an under-the-counter drug, a street corner drug, any kind of drug that we know of. So which one of those? Multiple choice. pick your answer, and the answer is 500. All the drugs we have interact with about 500 genes in their products. Now, it may well be that much of our genome is not, quote, druggable. Let's suggest, well, half of it isn't. We obviously don't know yet. Well, that's great. That means we've occupied 5% of biological space. There's a lot of work that can be done there. And in terms of going beyond the idea of a new drug might be something which would be wonderful because we use it twice a day instead of 3 times a day, going to the idea of completely new kinds of drugs because of new drug targets. And there are efforts already to do that. This happens to be one that is being employed in our intramural program at the NIH, using repurposing of a drug to attack a particular form of Niemann-Pick disease. And again, repurposing is part of this whole chemical genomics onslaught. So the whole idea of creating and harnessing big data, another theme for this meeting. I wanted to mention just briefly the Precision Medicine Initiative, which many of you heard the president first speak about in the State of the Union message. And this is the idea of really building a broad research program that's going to lead to really being able to understand how we do this thing called precision or personalized medicine. It's got 2 major themes to it so far, a near-term one, which is focusing on cancer, and then a longer-term one, which is really coming up with a knowledge base, which we don't have yet, to really get precision medicine into people's lives. So that's the idea of doing these kinds of things. I think obvious things to some folks in this audience, some of which I think will be developed a little later in the meeting, and creating as part of that a large national research cohort, at least 1 million folks, very possibly much larger. It's in the very early design phase right now, so we don't even know for sure will kids, pregnant women, et cetera, be part of this. I think many of us are quite interested that they should be, but that's part of what needs to go into thinking about this. How do we construct this cohort so it really answers the kinds of questions we want, using very much state-of-the-art and developing new tools to do that. So this is the kinds of things that such a cohort might be able to do. And interestingly, this is a slide I stole from Francis Collins, my boss. I figure the worst thing is if he finds out, he'll be flattered. And you'll notice, this is a slide he uses when he goes out and talks about the precision medicine issue. You'll notice how many of the themes that it talks about are themes of this conference. So let me get to a couple of more really specific to maternal and child health examples of the kinds of new things that we have in mind when we talk about new research. One is something called the Human Placenta Project. The idea behind this really comes from the fact that the human placenta is unarguably, I would say, the least understood human organ, but arguably incredibly important, clearly for maternal health and well-being, but also key for fetal health, fetal development. And we're beginning to get a fair bit of signal. Some of the things it does have a lifelong impact both on the woman and on the child that results from that pregnancy. So that's why it's worth looking at. I mean, it's an incredible organ if you think about it. It's the only human organ that we grow and discard more than once, that it has its own life cycle. During that life cycle, it does the work of lots of organs, that it uses lots of pathways to do that. I've begun to think about it as a model organism in some ways. It's so close to the human after all. And think about the program vascular growth to allow it usually to invade the uterus in a way that works for both. The program cell death, this really rapid life cycle it has, which again usually goes quite well. The fact that it allows these 2 separate individuals to coexist synergistically in terms of immune function. If we could understand all of those things, not only would it enable us to be much better at managing pregnancy, but it would tell us a lot when we think about fundamental human biology. However, to date, if you think about how have we studied the placenta, usually it's discarded. When it's not discarded, someone looks at it after birth, which means essentially, it's as though if I really want to understand how the heart functions, I would simply do a postmortem autopsy and look at the heart. Well, that would tell you some stuff, but it wouldn't really tell you much about heart function as opposed to structure. And for the placenta, it's particularly wrong because remember how much it changes over time. So you're seeing it at the end of this time. Even if you're looking at it partway through pregnancy, you're seeing it at the end of its life cycle kind of thing. Animal models have been helpful, but because of some of the unique qualities of human placentation, there are limits to how much we can apply animal models. And I might argue that applies more broadly than just at the placenta, but certainly true of the placenta. It's obviously kind of difficult to do in vivo assessment of the human currently because of issues of safety, et cetera, and where it's located. So the thinking behind this is if we could really increase knowledge about this, it would have a huge impact on our understanding, for instance, preterm birth, but other kinds of problems of pregnancy. So the idea was basically to have a unified, focused effort that would be cultivated or sort of coordinated from the top in some ways, but very much cultivate bottom-up ideas, that it would really get the field thinking about this, and very importantly, bring new people into the field. We had an interesting conference last year to kick this off by invitation only. We invited about 70 people, some folks in the room that were there, to this meeting to think about the Human Placenta Project. And we clearly invited a whole bunch of people with experience with the placenta and a whole bunch of people whose only association with the placenta had only been once years ago, and a few who've maybe recurrently had a placenta since then, but never had thought about it intellectually. And we'd invite these people, and they wrote back to us saying, I'm sorry, you must have mistaken, sent this to the wrong person. There's this great person across campus who I know spent their life looking at the placenta. You should invite them instead. And we would write back and say, no, that's why we want to invite you. We think you have a very interesting approach to other areas of biomedicine. You've never thought about the placenta before. We didn't say in parentheses, shame on you, but we said, why don't you come and sort of grow your repertoire and give us some of your best ideas? So we're hoping that that will happen. I must say we're having the second meeting later this month. It's not too late to register, April 27th and 28th in Bethesda. And currently we have over 350 people coming to that meeting, which makes it, I think, by several times the largest placenta meeting ever held. The ultimate goal of all this is simply to develop the ability to monitor human placental function, structure, and importantly, development in real time. All we know about that today is we don't know how to do it. But we know that it's very important. In some ways, it's vague, like the Human Genome Project. When that was started, all we knew is we didn't know how to sequence the human genome, but we thought it might be a good idea to develop approaches that enabled us to do that. So it's got a bunch of other goals as well. I just want to say something quickly about the principles. NICHD serves as a lead as this, but it's very much collaborative. We have other countries. Just got emails early this week. The Chinese would like to have a Chinese human placenta project. We said, great, we'll send somebody over to your meeting to hear what you're going to do and talk together about this. We're going to have intermediate deliverables and metrics with this, with the idea we are going to be pretty severe. We're going to let a lot of flowers sprout, and then we're going to cut a bunch of them off. The ones that don't seem to be going very far, we're going to stop them, and then redirect those resources to approaches that seem to be working. Open access data, open access research tools is going to be written into this. If anybody gets money from us to be part of this, they're going to make everything they figure out immediately available, et cetera. A great opportunity, we think, for transdisciplinary training, and it's going to sunset. This is not something that we're just going to keep funding forever. We've got a goal. Once we meet it, we're going to have a wonderful party. I hope I'm still alive to go to that party. We're going to have a wonderful party, and that's it. Something else we're starting that I want to say something briefly about MyPregnancy. This is the idea of crowdsourcing the condition of pregnancy. It's amazing to me, considering that pregnancy is an experiment that's done 4 million times a year in the US alone, that we don't really know its natural history in detail. So we thought, why don't we ask the experts, pregnant women? So we're creating an interactive web and app-based kind of way that women, depending upon how interested they are, whatever periodicity they like, can tell us about their pregnancy, answering structured questions. Depending upon how they answer them, be asked other questions. And also, as they give us their answers, we will link them to trusted, reliable sources, ACOG, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, other websites that are partners of ours in this, to give them really, so if a woman says, she's in the 12th week of pregnancy and she's vomiting a lot, we will take her to websites that say some things about that. and also tell her the kinds of questions she might ask her health provider the next time she sees it. And if she's curious to know how common is this, once the website has been up for a while, she can see in our ascertainment bias given in our respondents how often this is something they reported in pregnancy in the 12th week, for instance. And also, what it will allow is, let's say we have a researcher, let's say there's a researcher at Stanford who's very interested in some biomarker in women who are having hyperemesis in the 12th week. So if a woman reports she's vomiting a lot in the 12th week, another little flag will come up and say, so-and-so at Stanford is enrolling women who are having a lot of, vomiting in the 12th week into a study. If you are interested, click here, and you'll find out more about that study. So a way to do a big epi study, maybe, for instance, women in the Northwest have a higher incidence of something or other in pregnancy because they never see the sun compared to women here, for instance, or in the Southeast or something where they get more sun exposure. So epidemiologic, giving information to women, but also being able to flag some particular research they might be interested in. So let me close by saying something about this larger concept of kids' lives. And I think one way to think about this is intellectual and developmental disabilities. We clearly need research to better understand how to prevent intellectual and developmental disabilities. We've learned a lot. Newborn screening certainly plays a role here, et cetera. We need to develop better therapies in terms of medical therapies and cognitive behavioral therapies for kids who are born with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But the medical model here clearly is not sufficient. I think one could argue that most of the major advances in the lives of those with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the last 50 years, they have not been medical ones. They've been social change, increasing inclusion, lessening stigmatization, increasing expectations of others and of self for those with IDD and for how they will function in society, recognizing more about the rights, the contributions to society, the impact that those with disabilities, as Tim Shriver of the Special Olympics calls it, I think appropriately, recognizing the value of difference in our society, which is part of a much larger societal discussion, of course, but it's had huge impact. And I would argue it's not just in terms of intellectual and developmental disabilities, but other things. In terms of child nutrition, what's the greatest gain we've made in the last 50, 60 years? Probably WIC. In terms of early education, early STEM, Head Start. In terms of child safety, seatbelt campaigns. In terms of lots of things in child health, lessening unplanned pregnancies, better access to contraception. Reducing SIDS, it's understanding the research that made us understand some of the mechanism, but not much. It was really simply a back to sleep campaign that made the difference. Health insurance reform to provide better access. We're still battling that one. But those kinds of things, again, you can go on. And I would argue if we really care about maternal and child health, these are the kinds of things we have to care about, which includes doing research about them. This is part of NICHD's mission. Part of our mission is to ensure that all children have the chance to achieve their full potential for healthy and productive lives. If that's the case, we need to be a society that values children, which means we need to reduce the number of children who live in poverty, exposed to violence or other toxins, that we appropriately support education, including early infant STEM and other kinds of programs, that we need to have increased support for parenting, so parents aren't doing this alone, and the idea of viewing children as a shared societal responsibility and a shared societal investment. So I want to close by thanking you for what I know you in the room, the reason why you are here is because you spend the other 363 days a year doing the kind of work to advance the lives and the importance of children. But I also want to kind of, I was going to challenge you, but I don't think I can. For some reason, it's not on the slide. But I'd be interested, maybe we can get this a little bit in the Q&A that we're about to have. Are we at an inflection point in terms of this research, in terms of applying it to kids' lives? And if not, what do we need to do to make it an inflection point? What could we be doing to really change the nature of research into kids' health and well-being that would make real, not just small blips, but real changes in the lives of kids, both in the US and globally? So thank you very much.
Any questions from the audience? Yes. Robbie, would you? Yeah, if you can go to the microphone, that'd be great, because we're live streaming this conference and we'd want people that are watching.
So the question is, how do we increase the political influence of children? They are not effective political entity. There are lots of older people who, for Congress, get money for heart and cancer. Children don't have as active a constituency, and that has an impact on how federal resources are unfortunately allocated.
So I'm just smiling because I'm realizing this is being streamed, and I realize I'm a federal employee and I'm not allowed, for instance, to ask anyone to suggest anyone might lobby the federal government. It would be illegal for me to suggest something like that. So I would certainly never suggest that people would talk to either members of Congress or other policy leaders. So I won't suggest that anyone would take that kind of extreme step. However, I think it's legal for me to say that so much of this is about societal values and societal priorities and emphases. And I think we really, as a society, have to think about the importance of children and how much we're willing to devote in terms of resources. And by that, I don't simply mean money. It's time, attention, it's creative thinking, it's all the other kinds of things, to really promote the importance of children, to really not just do those things that common sense might say, well, gee, this is probably a good idea, but in fact to do the research, because some of the things that we thought were going to make a difference turn out not to make much of a difference. So I think we do need to truly invest, but it's not just money, it's our time and thinking as well.
Good. Other questions? Yes, Dr. Cornfield.
Hi, David Cornfield. Thank you, Dr. Guttmacher. I'm wondering, with the changes that you described so well, what are the implications for training? And how can we, as a group of educators, both inform and play a role in changing the training so that it'll fit with the paradigm you described?
I think it's a hugely important and fascinating question. Clearly, first of all, we need to always, and this has always been true, we need to remind ourselves that we're training the practitioners and members of society of the future, not of the past. And we've often tended to make the mistake that we train people to be ready to take care of the issues of the last 20 years rather than the next 20 or 30 years. So I do think we need to think about that. In terms of a very narrow, just think about the lives of pediatricians, I do think it's arguable that as we've got less and less infectious disease, yeah, we still need to be able to deal with otitis, but we need to begin to think about how we use that special relationship of the pediatrician with the child and with the family to truly think about lifelong health. And we're already beginning to do that some, but to truly think about, as we get, really, I do think this will be an inflection point. When you can sit there and look at the entire genome scan, this assumes you have a productive and working electronic health record. So if you bear, it's a bit of a futuristic view, so that when you have that, you would make decisions about which medications you use, but also look at risk factors the kid might have. It doesn't completely predict the future, but it tells you something about risk factors and how we begin to do that, which means, I think, amongst other things, we clearly need to be educating students, not just medical students, nursing students, other health-related students, and clearly practitioners, be it residents or others, in terms of literacy in the new sciences, genomics, et cetera, because if they're going to utilize it, let alone explain it to their patients, they need to be comfortable doing that.
Good. That's right.
Ron Ariano. A number of people have been talking about the value and importance of the electronic health record, and you just referred to it. However, what we're talking about in terms of research purposes is a virtual EHR. It really doesn't exist. And my question is, what national efforts are being made to really change the paradigm from a device that gives demographic and insurance relative information to one that really has research capability and import?
I can tell you there's a whole lot of time being spent within the Capital Beltway talking about this specific issue. Clearly as part of the Precision Medicine Initiative, but even before that, lots of efforts to talk about how we create electronic health records. I mean, forget even research, simply for patient portability. It has been noticed that patients don't actually spend their entire lifetime usually in the same healthcare system. So how do they transport their medical record with them when they go? That's a big enough issue. But then clearly in terms of creating research databases that talk to each other, There's a lot of effort, and I can tell you that clearly that's going to be a cardinal feature of this precision medicine initiative. It's not going to be a series of unrelated efforts, this HMO and that academic center or something. There's, as part of the ante to get at the table, you're going to have to agree to go by various practices that allow the data to be meshed across the systems. Absolutely essential, you're right.
One last question, just so we can stay on time. Yep, no, please, one more.
Sure. So I was curious about the genomic testing and the idea that, I mean, the sequencing has become so cheap now that if it costs $1,000 and in a few years it's going to cost $100, that's actually an irrelevant difference. $1,000 is already cheap enough, but there's clearly huge blockers to using this information to find cures for childhood diseases. So what kind of organizational and infrastructure changes are needed to remove those blockers? And just as an example, Harvard has a great project where you can contribute your own genomic data if you want to. It's not available to people under 18.
So I think basically this is really the kind of thing the Precision Medicine Initiative is being thought of to do. Because the problem is we've got the sequence, you're right, it's cheap. There's some questions about how accurate some of them are, but that can be taken care of. That's a minor technical issue at this point. The real question is, what does it mean? And we don't know that yet. And the only way to find out what all this information means is to put together, gets back to the last question too, put together large databases with lots of very well phenotyped, and I would emphasize very well phenotyped longitudinal data about people's health and lives, to be able to truly understand how the genome works, to truly understand why is a risk factor, what's the biology behind that, to truly understand what are the medications and other things we might design to intervene to do away with that risk factor, et cetera, et cetera. So we're just at the verge of this. That's why I would argue it's an inflection point, but there's a lot of work to be done. We've got the data. As is true of most things in science these days, it's not so much getting the data anymore, it's figuring out what it means. And that's the big challenge here, I think. You're right.
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to say that as we know the CHRI is to launch Healthy Lives, and I think Dr. Guttmacher has launched a healthy conference. And thank you very much, Alan, for a great.
Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you.